This is from the Frontlines with Jill and Edgar. Today we have special guests, Liz Darrow and Tara Villalba. Welcome. Can you introduce yourselves?
Hi, everybody. I'm Tara Villalba. My pronouns are sha and she. I live in Bellingham, Washington, which is the ancestral homelands of Lummi people.
Hey everybody, I'm Liz Darrow. I'm the media coordinator for community to community development, and also lucky to work alongside Jill and Tara in the movement. So this is kind of fun. This is like a hybrid podcast. We've got Jill from the Frontlines and also Community Voice. Welcome back to Community Voice, your ecofeminist radio show on KMRE 102.3 FM. So this is fun. I like this spirit of collaboration and getting it done. Thank you for joining me. I think we're going to talk about, I've been thinking about this, just like nuclear power, right, Tara, because you reached out a while back and just said, like, what are some needs around understanding these issues in Washington State and in general, right? So you've done some work in this area. I wonder if you could kind of just summarize like what it is you've been working on for the last little bit.
Sure. So I primarily work not on nuclear energy, but on dismantling nuclear weapons. Washington State has or holds in it the third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world, third only to Russia, and then the United States as a whole, and then Washington State. And those nuclear weapons are held at Bangor Base, which is on the Puget Sound, or it's on the other side on the Hood Canal, on the other side of the peninsula. My work on nuclear weapons abolition sort of comes together in this more heated environment about alternative energy sources and how there are many in the climate spaces that sort of consider nuclear energy to be a renewable energy source. And there's a lot of conflation between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons for good reason. That we can go into if you want to, but that these are not unrelated industries, but there are differences between them. So my work is primarily on trying to get rid of nuclear weapons and address the harms that were caused by nuclear weapons in the United States.
Yeah, that's pretty wild to hear that. Majority of the nuclear weapons are here in Washington State. I did not know that. I know that I've passed by some like abandoned like nuclear power plants before on the road, but I never knew that statistic, Data, about weapons being located here. I guess I'm also familiar with like like what happened with Hiroshima. Some folks don't know that I lived in Japan for 3 years, and that's something, that incident at the end of World War II, when the U.S. dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima. Many lives were lost, as well as like generational health impacts to this day around people just being affected by nuclear. Can you speak more about like those impacts of nuclear weapons?
I absolutely can, for sure. So Washington State was involved in the nuclear industries from its very beginning. So what was the Manhattan Project set up a nuclear production site in Washington State, and that we now know that site as the Hanford site, which is one of the most contaminated sites in the Western Hemisphere. That started in 1943, and it was intended to produce nuclear weapons, but it was a secret. It was a secret industry at that time because the United States was, sort of developing these weapons, scared that Germany was going to was going to create these weapons ahead of the United States. So some of the impacts that have happened is that Hanford, the site, was cited where it is cited now. One of the main reasons that it does that is because the nuclear production site needed a source of fresh cold water to cool their reactors when they're producing plutonium. And so, and the other main reason that it was cited at Hanford is because the Grand Coulee Dam had just been built, had just started producing energy, and there was all this excess energy and nowhere to put it into. And so a nuclear reactor requires large amounts of energy. That's what was available because of the Columbia River, because of how powerful the Columbia River is. It produced, the Grand Coulee Dam, the Bonneville Dam were built on the Columbia River. And as a result of it, indigenous nations were displaced from there. The site where Hanford was taken by the federal government. And it used to contain, or it still does actually contain, historical sites, ancestral sites for the Yakima, the Umatilla, and the Nez Perce nations. That was their territory, and they were removed from there. And settlers were removed from there. So white settlers who were farming in that area were also removed from there. Another impact is that in order to generate plutonium, you have to refine uranium. And so separate from Hanford, there are 2 uranium mining sites in Washington state. They're both located outside of the Spokane Reservation and upriver from the Spokane Reservation, where they mined uranium and milled uranium, which contaminates the water, contaminates the soil, and the people that work there. And then, of course, there were a lot of nuclear tests, hundreds of nuclear tests that were performed, and 67 of them were detonated in the Marshall Islands, and a large contingent of Marshallese have had to relocate to the United States. And there's a large community of Marshallese in the Spokane area. They've been impacted by nuclear testing as well. So, and then of course, the nuclear weapons that are stored here are stored at Bangor. They, that military base in Kitsap County is a big part of the local economy there. So it impacts, from the very western part of Washington state to the very eastern part of Washington state to the southern part of Washington state. People have been impacted by nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons also used to be stored at Fairchild Air Force Base outside of Spokane as well. So there's lots of connection inside Washington state.
Yeah, I've even seen a map where, the drift or the air, like the pollution of it reaches as far as Idaho and even a little bit of Montana and Oregon, just like beyond Washington state borders. And yeah, given that context too, it affects a lot of rural folks as well as indigenous tribes. Yeah, I do recall when Friend and Centered had our summit in 2018. There were some folks from that Yakima Nation speaking on Hanford as well, on how it's affected the health of their tribal members
and the workers too, right? Because aren't people still trying to clean this up? 60 years later or whatever?
Absolutely. So there are several organizations and tribes that have been very active in trying to clean up Hanford, as well as the Midnight Mine in Spokane. In the actual reactor in Hanford, the people that worked in the reactor were far more protected from radiation than the uranium miners in Spokane, for example, right? So that Spokane, so certain kinds of jobs are tiered inside the nuclear industry. Some jobs require a lot of education, and some jobs do not. So the lowest paid jobs, like uranium mining, uranium transportation, and milling, are not as protected. The workers don't have protective gear. They weren't told, even though the mining companies knew of the health risks, they weren't told of the health risks, which is very different from, say, a nuclear reactor at Hanford, where people had their safety equipment, protective equipment, when they would work with things that would potentially expose them to radiation. And then, of course, it's because of that, it's very uneven what the resources are available for people who have been exposed to radiation. So just this year, this bill, Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, that pays for that pays the lump sum for people who've been exposed to radiation because of uranium mining or milling or transportation, or exposed to nuclear tests, and what Jill was talking about, downwinders, meaning the plumes that are released after a nuclear explosion are carried downwind. And when it rains, it affects the people that are exposed to those clouds, right? So there's this bill provides some compensation, not enough, but some compensation for people. And that bill was going to lapse this year in July, and it was extended. But there are many, many more people who are not covered under that bill. People who have worked to clean up potential radiation exposures, right? They've cleaned up nuclear waste. They've cleaned up after explosions, and they're not covered in the bill. So there is a movement led by downwinders and people who have been exposed to radiation to actually expand and extend RECA, the bill that I was talking about, beyond 2 years, because this year it was extended by 2 years, but it is not enough. And people are literally going to die before they get compensation. And so it really needs to be extended. The original bill tries to extend it for 19 years and to extend the people and the illnesses, expand the scope of the coverage of this bill. So that's just one of the sort of health impacts. Liz, you mentioned that you mentioned ecofeminism, and one of the things that people really need to understand is that radiation exposure impacts women very differently in terms of our reproductive health. Because of that, it can impact generations beyond the people that were initially exposed. Because a woman carries in her, when she is exposed, carries in her all the eggs that she's ever going to make. A little girl who's exposed carries in her all the eggs she's ever going to make. So that damage that is at the cellular level can get passed down to generations of people.
We're going to go now to a music break, and we'll be right back with Tara Villalba and Jill Mangaliman.
My eyes are wide this morning, but my heart is heavy still. There's a sea inside me storming, 'cause I'm battling with my will. Though I may grow tired and weary and ache within my bones, I will fight for what I believe in, even if I fight alone. I know that I'm gonna keep on moving on. gathered my armor, and I'm ready for battle. I got my weapons strong, taking the road less traveled, and I'm ready to do this, and nobody can stop me, 'cause I'm thoroughly convinced this is my love and it runs deep. In my life, there have been many who have tried to break me down, but I know in my soul, oh, that I am upward bound. Doesn't matter what they think of me, 'cause I know what I was born to be. I don't do it 'cause it's trendy. I hold on to my integrity, manifest my own reality, and soon all the haters will see that nobody can stop me, yeah. 'Cause I gathered my armor, and I'm ready for battle. I got my weapons strong, taking the road less traveled, and I'm ready to do this, and nobody can stop me, 'cause I'm thoroughly convinced this is my love and it runs deep.
Skinny ass black girl back in the class. Didn't try, didn't think I could pass. Didn't fight 'cause I had already lost more than my share of battles. Before I hit double digits, many tried to break me, make me give up. Listen, not playing stupid so they don't feel intimidated. Give up on my dreams and goals for theirs to be accommodated. Let them use my mind and body, making they shit look saucy. Not speak up and use my gifts 'cause they might call me bitch and bossy. Know in my soul what I'm down here for. Exactly what I love, what my crown me for. What I hold they can't touch, what I had they can't buy. When toe to toe with doubt a couple times, abandoned that lie. Yeah, I lost some battles, but I win the war. Hate to stay underestimated, I'll settle the score. Run deep like the blood in my veins, it give me fever. Till I'm running the game, say a diva.
And I gather my armor, and I'm ready for battle. I got my weapons strong, taking the road less traveled, and I'm ready to do this, and nobody can stop me, 'cause I'm thoroughly convinced this is my love and it runs deep. Yeah, this is my love and it runs deep. Whoa, this is my love and it runs deep. This is my love and it runs deep.
Talking with Jill Mangaliman and Tata Villalba, and that song we were just listening to was shared with us by Tata. Can you tell us a little bit about the music?
Sure. This song is called Run Deep, and it's by a woman artist, Deva Mahal, and it features Coco Pela, who raps in the background. And it just speaks to me about our strength and our resilience as women, and how, you know, we don't know if we're going to win, but we're definitely going to lose if we don't get into it. So, and so it's sort of, to me, it just sort of is a wonderful way to speak to that place where many women, we find ourselves, you know, where we find ourselves. You could almost say we don't have the option not to act, but we do, because many people don't act. But we do, because not acting is worse, you know, or has worse outcomes for us than acting.
Yeah, I love that distinction, because it is a choice to not act that we've seen for many, many years in many different ways. And then the false choices that we're left with, like you were talking about with the Spokane tribe and the folks who are left to clean up the things that have happened, that many communities would have said no if they'd been asked. So I think that's really important, especially from a perspective of, okay, so now what? So there was a lot of media around leaking into the Columbia, like about 5 years ago, I think. I haven't seen a lot on that lately. But what's going on? Is Hanford still leaking into the Columbia?
I don't feel completely qualified to actually answer that question. There are other organizations like Columbia River Keepers and like the Yakima Nation that track this much more closely. But from what I understand, when the United States started this enterprise into nuclear weapons, they didn't have a plan for what to do with the nuclear waste. And, sort of how contaminated and contaminating that waste would be. So their initial plans were to sequester the waste into containers that wouldn't leak. And they planned for, I think, like 50 years of storage, which has gone way beyond that now. And there is only in the whole world, so the US is not the only one that has nuclear weapons, right? But in the whole world, there's only been one feasible plan for how to store nuclear waste, and that is in Scandinavia. Everywhere else, it's been a scramble. It's sort of like a hodgepodge of whatever people could do to store nuclear waste. The United States has an enormous problem of what to do with the nuclear waste that they have generated. And at the same time, they are financing, the taxpayers, we are financing a whole new generation of nuclear weapons because the Pentagon argues that our nuclear weapons are getting too old and unreliable. And so we need to create a new generation of nuclear weapons, which will create, again, a lot of the same things. And people will say, oh, but they can recycle plutonium pits and they can use, things that have already been created. But that's not the plan. That's not the plan. The plan is not to reuse what's already produced, but to produce more. And again, still, there is no plan for what to do with the nuclear waste. And so they're trying to site these waste storage facilities in communities that don't give consent, in communities that tend to be poor, tend to be rural, and tend to be communities of color. And that is a huge equity problem.
This I've heard this at like national climate conferences. I want to hear your take on this. Governments were saying that cleanup jobs are considered green jobs. What do you think about that? I mean, I weigh it out like they're cleaning up the environment, but then they're exposing themselves to these things. And then often enough, they go to people of color, folks who are, lower income. Do you buy that? Are these quote unquote green jobs?
I don't think so. I don't think so. Our society isn't structured in a way that the lowest paid jobs are the best protected jobs. That's not how our economy works. In our economy, the people who make the lowest wages are often the most unprotected workers. And so I don't expect in cleanup operations that the people who have the most likelihood of being exposed will be the people that are most protected from that exposure. Oftentimes, scientists are protected. People who work with the technology are protected, but people who are moving the waste, people who are lining the ponds, like they are often not the most protected people. And if we even just take like the example of Spokane, so or the Midnight Mine, which is actually outside of Spokane, right outside. The Spokane Reservation is outside of the city of Spokane, and it's by the river. And most people who live in the Spokane Reservation still count on hunting, fishing, and gathering food and medicine from the areas where they live. And their choice now is to choose not to do what their culture has taught them, or to consume the plants and animals that are contaminated by radiation from the mine. The Midnight Mine was closed in 1981. And the remediation plan to clean it up wasn't passed until after 2010. And remediation didn't actually start until just last year. So you can see what kind, and in the meantime, what were people supposed to do with uranium ore that's left out in the open, with contaminated water that isn't remediated? And now with the remediation plan, Spokane Tribe worked really hard to make sure that the standards against which the water would be tested for levels of contaminants was going to be their standard, not the state standard, because the state standard is slower than what the Spokane Tribe standard is, right? So it's sort of, the mine was sited right outside of Spokane Reservation. Who would we expect would work in the mine? Who would want to work in a mine in that situation? It would be people who are poor and people who are close by, right? So without ever saying anything about Indigenous people, those were the people, they were the people that worked in the mines. Now that they're cleaning it up, who are they going to ask to clean it up, right? And one of the biggest concerns is that there's going to be a new generation of exposure in the cleanup process, because who are they going to recruit to clean up that mess? I don't think that is part of a just transition. The cleanup definitely has to be part of the transition, right? But it isn't just in that sense. And we really would want to ask, that's one of the things that most people really don't ask. How much do people make when they are being contracted to clean up? What kinds of worker protections are in place for them, right? Whereas, the steel workers, electrical workers that work in a nuclear facility are unionized, miners, millers, cleanup folks are not unionized. So then what happens to their working conditions? Those are the questions that I think, when we talk to ordinary people whose lives are not focused on getting rid of nuclear weapons, those are the questions that we kind of have to be able to ask our lawmakers and answer for people who are like, why should I care about nuclear weapons? Why should I care about this new generation of nuclear weapons? Because we're not asking what happens to the lowest paid workers in that industry.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, the way it was framed to me at that conference was like, these are jobs, these are good jobs. And what I'm hearing is, though, that's like a package wrapped, that of a Pandora's box, actually. It's almost like tricking the community, like, we're going to make it better. If we're going to clean up the river, here's some good jobs, but then not telling the whole truth that you're going to be exposed or have these contractualization type jobs with no benefits or job security or protections. It's just like, the economy repeating history again, like trying to tell people these are good things coming into your community, but actually it's really deadly and can cost, multiple generations of people's health. And people are still fighting, still till this day, trying to raise the issue of Hanford and raise the impacts of nuclear. Not just in Washington, but other places too. I hear the movement is still picking up. Like island nations that were like, even like Guam or folks over in Arizona who are affected by the uranium mining. There's a lot of evidence out there that these aren't good for our people or our planet, and yet the government still pushes upon it for the weaponry, for the quote unquote renewable energy. Do we have a sense though, like where these weapons are going to be used, or what are they doing with them? Since there's such a demand.
That's the biggest irony about nuclear weapons, is that nuclear weapons are created so that they won't be used. That's the argument. It's the circular argument around nuclear weapons, is that we need nuclear weapons so that hopefully we will never use them. And we need to make bigger weapons so that the other people can be deterred from using their weapons. And then they're going to make bigger weapons so that we can be deterred. And it's just, so you know, that's how the arms race works. Really, beginning in 2017, the United States started to invest almost $2 trillion over the next 30 years to build a new generation of nuclear weapons. And we already know that it's going to cost more than $2 trillion to create this new generation of nuclear weapons. You said, what's the demand for it? Well, nuclear weapons is big business. You know, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, they are getting contracts to create these weapons and their delivery systems, right? So not just the actual warhead, but the rocket, the missile that will deliver that, the airplanes that will drop the bombs. So it's a huge industry, the military industry, but in particular, the nuclear weapons industry is still, you know, a huge moneymaker for the people that make the nuclear weapons. If you listen, I can send you links. If you listen to Senate and House Armed Services Committee hearings, they justify having these weapons. The military justifies having these weapons to prevent other countries, but in particular, Russia and China, to be on par with the United States in terms of their weapons, right? So they're saying we need to make them because we don't know what Russia and China are going to do. And you've probably noticed there has been an increase in sort of talk in the general media about China aggressing against the United States, not just economically, but militarily, right? And I'm not trying to be alarmist here, but the United States is making huge moves in Oceania, across the Pacific Ocean. They have gone through, you know, if you look at how US forces and their allies, they ring around China. And their idea is to contain China, right? China has, Washington State, it's just Washington State, has more nuclear weapons than the entire country of China. We're not in the same, you know, China has something like 300 and something nuclear weapons. The United States has to the tune of like 6,800. We're not in the same playing field. Russia and the United States are, but the United States and China, no, we're not. But they make it sound like we are to justify a new generation of nuclear weapons.
Wow. Yeah, it sounds like US imperialism is trying to remain on top, top dog. But even, like hearing the $2 trillion, like that's a big chunk of budget that could be used for, schools, healthcare. And I sure as know, like, the millionaires aren't paying taxes. So where's that money coming from? Amazon's not paying taxes. Yeah.
This project is underwritten by US taxpayers. That's the thing about this modernization project, is that, They are modernizing the nuclear weapons are the Pentagon talks about it all the time, that nuclear weapons are the backbone of US defense, that all other US defense strategy depends on the existence of nuclear weapons. That's who we are in the world. Is that really who we want to be in the world? Because if you ask ordinary Americans, I don't know that that is really what ordinary Americans want for themselves, to be seen as, we make people do what we want because we have nuclear weapons, which at the bottom is what it is. After everything else, that is what it is. There's already a move that is couched as like anti-Russian, like, you should support this bill because you hate the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine. There's a bill that's been introduced to grow the US uranium supply, meaning they want to start uranium mining again across the United States so that the US is quote unquote self-sufficient for all its uranium needs. There is a plan to store nuclear waste at a facility that is sort of in between New Mexico and Texas, surrounded by poor communities. And there is a huge resistance against that. But again, they are fighting a very large, powerful industry. So these things are already happening. And really the key, is how do we talk to, how do we spread this information and make it be part of what we are thinking about when we're talking about a just transition? When we're talking about a different economy, what place is in that economy for militarism and for nuclear weapons, which is, should be zero, right? But how do we make sure that this is part of our conversation, because it's sucking up a huge amount of resource that we can't afford to spend on it.
Right. And is there any stopping it? Like, is this a done deal that they are going to manufacture a whole new generation, or is there any mechanism for stopping that monster before it's released?
That's on us, right? That is our job. Our job is how to stop this this process from taking place, and we do have to find all the different places to stop this from happening. It is not impossible. In the 1980s, there was a huge movement of grassroots, not just in the United States, but across the world, that succeeded in reducing nuclear weapons just across the board between Russia and the United States. They went from something like 40,000 weapons to 6,000 weapons. It is possible. It has been done, and we, it's difficult to imagine a world without nuclear weapons for people maybe who lived with nuclear weapons or who were around when it was created. But literally, nuclear weapons are irredeemable. There's no reason for us to actually have them. If once you understand the damage that it causes from the beginning of it all the way to the end, from the uranium mining and the planning of it and the testing of it to what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and all over in Nevada and Arizona where it was tested, in the Marshall Islands where it was tested, to the nuclear waste at Hanford, in New Mexico, in many other places in the United States, in the Marshall Islands, where the military's idea was to bury the waste and then cover it with concrete. And now with rising sea levels, that barrier, that concrete that they had poured on top of it, is shifting and leaking radioactive material into the ocean. And people's rationale is that the ocean is so big that it will dilute any radiation, which is just sort of like the most insane way to think about polluting our planet. Well, it's just a little bit, and the ocean can handle it because it's just a little bit. It's just, goes against our relationship with nature, I think. So is there a way to stop it? We don't know, but it's not going to stop if we don't try.
We're in this moment where we see what has happened since the 40s with nuclear weapons and that damage, and then seeing a new wave coming. That's just horrific. It's so violent and it's so extreme, and it feels very patriarchal, and like a thing is being done to us as people. So that that will to just push as much as we can in all the ways that we can. And part of that, I think, really is letting people know this is what it means. Because, I've lived in Washington State all my 42 years, and I didn't really know that much about Hanford. It was just like, oh, that's dangerous sciencey stuff. But we didn't learn about it coming up in school. And when I started reading about the workers and just what has been done there to the river and the people and the atmosphere, it's just like, it's pretty horrible. It really is. And I, as part of the just transition framework that we talk about, it's like, we have to believe that's not the only way, right? And how does this fit? I really like what Jill brought up, is like, how does this fit into that framework? Because we're going to have to clean it up. And I'm wondering too, just as we just have a little bit more time left here, if we could draw some distinctions, like we started out in the show talking a little bit about nuclear energy versus nuclear weapons. Because clean energy is another one of those things I feel like politically, in our state, people use that to run campaigns. And then there's, like the Green New Deal on a more national level. But what are we really talking about? And do you get a sense that, like, with nuclear energy, that's going to be like when they were talking about clean coal, you could have clean coal processing, right? But I think we see that that's not really a thing. So can you just give us like a regular person's guide to nuclear energy? Like, what are we talking about?
Absolutely. So I just want to acknowledge that, this is my own personal opinion. and in my opinion, as a person who is interested in the just transition, and understands the disproportionate impacts that our communities face because of decisions that were not made for us, for our wellness. You were saying that, people might consent if they were given a choice, and choice just runs so deep. If people had another way to survive and we didn't push them to the brink, would they still choose to mine uranium? I don't know. I don't think so. If the Spokane had not been moved off of their territory in order to make the Grand Coulee Dam, would they have been in the position where they would have wanted to get wealthy by digging up uranium? I don't know. We will never know, because that's not the way that it worked. The way it worked was, they were displaced for the Grand Coulee Dam in the 1930s, and they didn't get compensated until this year, 2022. It's a long string of injustice. Okay, nuclear weapons, nuclear energy is basically the byproduct that you get when you split atoms. It creates a lot of energy, and that is what's harvested as nuclear power, right? The reaction is controlled, as opposed to, you can think of it this way. A nuclear reactor generating electricity makes that energy by slowly facilitating the decomposition of a fuel, say like uranium, right? And when uranium breaks down, you break down the particles of a uranium atom. It produces things like plutonium, which then you end up as, quote unquote, a waste product, right? Because then the more broken down it is, the more energy it takes to break it down some more, right? So nuclear energy is the prolonged release of a nuclear reaction. A nuclear weapon is releasing that energy all in one go. That's the difference. But it's essentially, that's the process, is harnessing a nuclear reaction, slowing it down, cooling it down, slowing it down so that you can harvest the energy, or letting all the energy go out uncontrolled in a nuclear weapon. Is it renewable? People argue that it is because the fuels can last for a long time. It takes a long time to break down all of the atoms, or most of the atoms. So in that sense, it is. But really, I think we are not asking enough accountability for our communities when we mine these fuels that we use, whether it's for burning it as fossil fuels or whether it's splitting them for nuclear energy. The point is that when you dig up these things, there's a reason that they are under the ground. There's a reason that we can live in an area that has fossil fuel or uranium deposits underneath it. And it's because it's protected by the earth. We didn't open it up for exposure. When we open it up, of course we're exposed, So I think the deeper question here is not whether or not the fuel itself is renewable, which is what greenwashing will want you to believe, right? What we're actually after, what needs to happen, and people, it's so hard for people to consider this. What needs to happen is we have to consume less energy. And people don't want that. They want a transition where they don't have to change their lives and their lifestyles in order to get into a better relationship with nature. But it can't happen. It can't happen. What Indigenous nations have asked us over and over again is, do not fish as much as you do. Do not till the soil as much as you do. Do not consume as much energy as you are consuming, because it's unsustainable. We can't sustain that level of consumption. And that, I think, is the key. People don't want to do that, at least not in the United States. They want a transition where they don't have to change the way that we live, where we don't have to rethink what would it look like if we all had less access to energy. What if our plugs didn't have running currents in it 24/7 when we don't need it? What if we could only have it during these hours, only to charge these things and only for hospitals? What if that happened? People don't want to consider that. And that I think is at the core of what we're trying to talk about, energy resilience. That is what we need to head towards. And that's not where we're headed when we keep trying to find ways to meet the existing energy needs that we have.
Yeah, that is for real the thing. People don't want to adjust their lives. They want to find a way to just keep going and going and going. I think we see this with the electric car discussions and just moving away from certain types of fuels into other types of fuels. Like, that math will never check out, right? I mean, that's really what we're facing, is that
it really won't.
Yeah.
We're talking about, the fact that these fuels last forever, like literally almost forever, like hundreds of thousands of years. We're also talking about the waste that they produce last that long too.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about an environment, it's some of the most absurd things is like, if they dig up a hole that is deep enough with the consent of people to bury waste deep enough, how do we make sure that 200,000 years from now, that some unsuspecting animal isn't going to go digging in there, and and some unsuspecting group of humans aren't going to go digging in there, wondering what this huge structure is, and what are and people's responses are like, well, we have to have good science. I'm like, if our problem is signage, then we're looking in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
You know, that's sort of, yeah, that's what I would say to regular people is like,
Yeah.
we're looking in the wrong direction.
Right. Absolutely. All those keep out signs since time immemorial have not really helped us when it comes to curiosity and just wanting to know. Well, and in this case, like you're talking about, like wanting to know how long can this go on with the absolute max capacity of go all the time. Like, I think this is it. I think we're close. So it's really helpful to hear you talk about the difference actually between like a monstrous thing that is controlled and released a little bit at a time and a monstrous thing that's let go all at once. It's the same thing that we're talking about, right? With different applications. Thank you for pointing that out. And thank you for having this conversation with me. I appreciate you so much. I learned a ton.
Thank you. A pleasure, Tara. I've learned so much from you just in this last, 30 minutes. I think we have a big battle ahead of us.
We do.
Yeah. And you're right. We got to try because there's a lot at stake. Our home, our land, and our people. And many, many lives. So I want to close us out with a song that, whenever I hear it, it's about healing. Leon Bridges' River. It kind of soothes my soul. I hope it soothes yours, especially after hearing like some difficult things that are happening in the world. I hope we can all go back to the river and, find comfort in that. The world is vast and beautiful, and we have to fight for it. And yeah, thank you again for sharing about this issue. And we'll see you next time from the Frontlines.
Thanks, Jill.
Yeah. Thank you so much for giving me space to share some of this information. I really hope people find it useful. And this work continues. They can plug in. There's a coalition that is statewide called the Washington Against Nuclear Weapons Coalition. There are hundreds, if not thousands of us working on this across the state of Washington. So on all the different components of it. So yeah, there's, you don't have to do it alone. Nobody here has to do it alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara.
Been traveling these wide roads for so long. My heart's been far from you, 10,000 miles gone. Oh, I wanna come here and give every part of me, but there's blood on my hand. And my lips are unclean, In my darkness I remember Mama's words reoccur to me. Surrender to the good Lord and to wipe your slate clean. Take me to your river, I wanna go. Oh, go. Take me to your river, I wanna know. Dip me in your smooth waters, I go in. As a man with many crimes, come up for air. As my sins flow down the Jordan, oh, I wanna come here and give you every part of me. But there's blood on my hands, and my lips are unclean. Take me to your river, I wanna go. Oh, go. Take me to your river,